The USS Hornet awaits the scrap heap after being decommissioned for the last time. It seems unfair for a ship that battled so hard to reclaim the Pacific from the Japanese. This is the story of the ship that fought back first. What makes a man pilot a plane against overwhelming odds and survive attackers willing to turn themselves into human bombs? Hornet was the gray ghost that returned to haunt the Japanese Navy. With a fighting brotherhood of men that refused to leave her behind. No national hero has ever fallen lower than the last USS Hornet. She floats as an antique curiosity at the soon-to-close Alameda Naval Air Station in the autumn of 1995. Fundraising to buy her for a museum ship has failed. No one wants anything to do with her anymore.
The Navy then took the ship from the ship donation program and put it up for sale for scrap. It was sold for approximately $167,000.
Sitting at the very pier from which her predecessor Hornet began one of the most daring missions in U.S. Navy history a half-century before, CB-12 could be the final American warship to carry the name.
Since the beginning of the Navy up until World War II and through World War II, we've had 8 USS Hornets.
The first Hornet is a 10-gun sloop in the Revolutionary War. Successive Hornets fight in the War of 1812, the Civil War, and the Spanish-American War. The name reaches the modern Navy during the 1930s. It's a time of Japanese aggression across the Pacific. The Imperial Navy grows its fleet and carrier forces. But America's quick need for carriers puts carrier design up against an old stumbling block. The United States is still limited in the size of warships under a naval treaty that Japan had renounced at the end of 1936.
After World War I, the treaty was established to limit the total tonnage of ships for each country. There was only so many tons that were allotted for this carrier group to be built on. And it was under by several thousand tons, which caused it to be shorter, less armored, therefore top heavy, and it rolled in the seas.
7 earlier U.S. carriers, some converted from other kinds of ships, are compromises fumbling for the correct technology. By 1938, the Navy realizes that all existing plans are obsolete. But they are 2 years away from starting to build a state-of-the-art carrier, and time has become an unaffordable luxury. To get at least one new carrier begun immediately, President Franklin D. Roosevelt authorizes Hornet as one last ship of the old Yorktown class. As the 8th aircraft carrier of the United States Navy, Hull 385 is designated CV-8. She launches on December 14, 1940.
It was built in Newport News, Virginia, and it was sponsored by Mrs. Knox. Mr. Knox was the Secretary of the Navy at the time. It was the most beautiful ship you ever saw. When we walked down that pier to go on board and you look, it's like, my God, it's a monster. Flight deck was 800 some odd feet.
The new $32 million ship has barely 2.5 years to live. Her first skipper is Captain Mark Mitcher.
He was the
the ultimate and the commanding officer of a ship. He not only had the safety of the ship in mind, but the safety of everybody aboard. He trusted everybody in their knowledge and their ability to do their job.
Hornet is somewhat advanced over her Yorktown derivative. She is 827 feet long and 114 feet wide at the flight deck. She displaces 25,500 tons under full load. Speed is her best feature. Her 4-geared turbine engines spin 4 propellers for a top speed of 33 knots, fast enough to keep up with any known task force ship, including destroyers. But the flaws that will help doom Hornet are in place. Her topside armor is not on her flight deck, but concentrated on the floor of the hangar deck below to protect fuel, ammunition, and machinery spaces. Bombs of any size can penetrate to the vulnerable pack of planes one deck down. Even more unfortunate is the design that has put her 2 boiler rooms together, just forward of 2 adjoining engine rooms. A bomb or torpedo piercing either engine or fire room can cripple propulsion at 1 stroke. The 81 warplanes that Hornet carries, a mix of Wildcat fighters, Devastator torpedo bombers, and Dauntless dive bombers, leave much to be desired. Like Hornet's design, they belong to a much earlier age.
The aircraft that it got were not the best. They weren't the bottom of the barrel, but they were not the best and the most modern. Morale in the United States was rock bottom because of Pearl Harbor, and that they came in that close to the United States.
You know, when somebody hits you in the jaw, you want to hit him back. And that's what it was with us.
But in April of 1942, all of Hornet's aircraft are stored out of the way as an alien breed of plane is craned onto her flight deck at Alameda, California. Aboard come 16 twin-engine Army B-25 bombers as Hornet CV-8 prepares to launch the most dramatic mission in the chronicles of the United States Navy, the Doolittle Raid. A long-shot attack on Japanese cities, including Tokyo. Forgotten by history is that Hornet, with her fighter planes stored below on the hangar deck or crowded out by B-25s on the flight deck, is without her main defenses and in danger as great as that faced by the Army pilots.
So you had 80 planes in the overhead and on deck, but useless to us as long as the B-25s were on the flight deck. And once we got out to sea, we met the Enterprise, and then the announcement came that we're on our way to bomb Tokyo. There were just cheers all over the ship. And we were all ready to go. They wanted to go into battle. And we really weren't going into battle because we were the main ship bringing the B-25. If we were attacked, the Enterprise planes would be the air cover. They would be in battle. Our gun crews would be in battle, but not our planes. were around 600 miles away from Tokyo when we were spotted by a Japanese boat. One of our cruisers stepped out of line and sunk the Japanese boat. But we weren't sure if he got the message off that he spotted us. They weren't going to take a chance. They're going to take off right then and there at 600 miles, which they didn't have enough gas for.
Quickly, Hornet's crewmen begin a desperate foot race to give the Army pilots some small chance of survival.
So now we had to put crews together, and we ran 5-gallon cans of gasoline, extra cans, to each B-25, hoping that we can give them enough fuel after they bomb that they can get away. We really hoped that the gasoline cans that we put on board would help them get to an island that was safe.
Hornet has its own casualty of the raid.
See, the orders were for the deck crew, if a plane doesn't function correctly, push it over the side, get it out of here. Well, the crew ran out on a 7th plane, which wouldn't turn over. And as the crew ran out, one of the seamen got out there, and the plane revved up and took the seaman's arm off. But the plane revved up, and everyone took off.
With the raiders in flight, Hornet quickly brings up and launches her own planes. They take part in attacking 16 Japanese picket boats appearing around the now retreating task force. The men tensely await word of the success or failure of the attack they have launched.
The captain got on and said they received that the bombing was a success. They cheered and they screamed and whatever. They were very happy that the whole thing was a success. As far as what damage the Army did, it was practically nil. But they bombed 3 cities. And the American morale went back up.
Delayed by a need to resupply after the Doolittle raid, Hornet must now race to the aid of American carriers confronting a Japanese thrust at Australia's lifeline in the Coral Sea.
We arrived at Pearl Harbor, refueled, put new supplies on board, and they sent the Hornet to Coral Sea to help the Lexington and the Yorktown. By the time we got there, Lexington was sunk. Yorktown was damaged. All we could do was escort the Yorktown back to Pearl Harbor.
We went immediately back to Pearl Harbor and restocked. And while we were getting all this done and getting more supplies aboard, come up the Midway engagement. So we were sent out right away to join the fleet to catch the Japanese trying to capture Midway Island.
For the second time in her brief life, Hornet was about to fight against huge odds in a desperate naval showdown. By June of 1942, Hornet is part of a small, hard-pressed remnant of the U.S. fleet in the Pacific. with the main battle line at the bottom of Pearl Harbor and Lexington sunk in the Coral Sea. CV-8 is one of only 5 carriers surviving as America's last significant naval strength. She dodges through the Pacific, holding off the huge Imperial Navy. Now the Japanese Navy moves an enormous attack force to seize Midway Island and its long-range bomber airstrips. The 69-ship Imperial force includes 7 battleships and 6 carriers.
When we pulled out of Pearl and we joined the Enterprise and the Yorktown, Admiral Nimitz had us go north and take a position, they called it Point Luck. And they had broken the code on the Japanese, and they knew where the Japanese were going and what they were headed for. So they put us in position to wait for the Japanese fleet to come into range. And when they did, then we went and attacked them. We were the first ones to find the Japanese fleet, and they shot down the whole squadron.
The opening ambush of the Japanese carrier force is a tragic shambles. All 15 devastators of Hornet's Torpedo Squadron 8, attacking low, slow, and straight ahead without air cover, are slaughtered by an impenetrable wall of ships' anti-aircraft fire and swarming Zero fighters. Ensign George Gay is the only survivor from Hornet. Back on the carrier, the disaster rocks the close-knit squadron's maintenance crews.
It was all of the torpedo squadron that were left, the maintenance people and what pilots hadn't gone, were all grouped in a ready room, and we kind of stayed away from them. That was their sad time, and we sure didn't want to interfere with them.
The 3 torpedo groups lose 38 of 41 planes. But Hornet's sacrifice is key to a dramatic turn of battle. With the Japanese fighters still drawn down low after the Hornet torpedo attacks, dive bombers from Yorktown and Enterprise hurtle out of high clouds to devastate 3 Japanese carriers caught rearming planes. By the end of the day, 4 Japanese carriers are afire and sinking, with many of their irreplaceable crews and pilots lost. Upon Hornet's return after battle, Mark Mitcher shows again what makes a great commander.
We had lost our torpedo squadron, and we had lost most of our fighter planes. So we came back into Pearl, and they had squadrons that had come out from the States to replace us. And he said, "No, you're not." He said, "I'll take your airplanes, but you can't have the people that are on this ship."
With their sister ship Yorktown sunk by a submarine's torpedo during the Midway battle, Hornet is now one of only 4 carriers left to oppose the Japanese overrunning the South Pacific. And her own luck is running out. When U.S. forces land on Guadalcanal in the Solomon Island chain in the South Pacific, both sides see a decisive campaign of the war. With vastly superior strength, the enemy rushes in reinforcements. The U.S. Navy hurls its last carriers, including Hornet, into the meat grinder to support the landed troops. On August 24th, 3 bomb hits send Enterprise back to Pearl Harbor. On August 31st, a submarine torpedo put Saratoga out of action the same way. On September 15th, Wasp is torpedoed and scuttled. And just like that, Hornet becomes the last available American carrier in the Pacific, relentlessly hunted by the Imperial Navy. On October 26, Hornet finds herself in the path of a huge Japanese sortie, moving off the Santa Cruz Islands. Japan's 4 carriers, 4 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 30 destroyers mean to draw out what's left of the U.S. fleet and destroy it for good. Although Enterprise has been patched up enough to return, the odds against the tiny force remain long.
It was shortly after sunrise when they come over the loudspeaker system and told us that we had launched a strike against the Japanese, and they had launched a strike and the planes were coming at us.
Hornet's own air groups shrug off their slim chances and press the attack with aggressiveness. They find and severely damage the Japanese carrier Shokaku and the heavy cruiser Shikumi. But beneath the Hornet pilots, their own ship is dying.
See, the Enterprise, fortunate enough, went into a fog bank. You couldn't see the Enterprise from the air. But the Hornet was in the open. Around 8 or 9 a.m., the first bomb came through the Hornet's elevator. There were planes of every type, torpedo planes, dive bombers, kamikaze, suicide dives. And then the bombs kept coming. The strafing kept coming. And finally, a suicide dive came right through officers' country, right into my elevator pit. I had no other choice but run like hell the other way. We took a beating you wouldn't believe. The Hornet was beyond repair. It was listing badly. The crews, they took off. They left because their planes couldn't come back.
It was about 4 o'clock in the afternoon before they finally decided that we were hit too bad. We couldn't get underway. The rudder was jammed. The cruiser Northampton tried to tow us. About the time they got the cable hooked up, the Japanese came in with another raid. They didn't want to get the Northampton sunk too, so they cut her loose. And they decided that they had to get the fleet out of there and to get away from the Japanese. We were going to have to leave the Hornet.
It was an awful feeling. Now you're really leaving a ship that you love, and you couldn't believe that it was the end. We were very fortunate to get the wounded off after the first attack. All in all, I think about 300 men were lost in the whole battle.
Some 2,919 survivors are taken aboard other ships. Ablaze from stem to stern, Hornet floats after hits by 9 torpedoes and 400 rounds of 5-inch shell fire by escorts attempting to scuttle her. Defying her supposed design weaknesses, she won't succumb to American fire. She waits for the Japanese enemy to arrive to fire 4 last torpedoes into her hull.
And the last time I saw her, she looked very lonesome. She was listing badly to starboard. Lines were hanging down off of the flight deck the guys had used to get off. Just like she had been, like we abandoned her. Which we really had.
Exactly 1 year and 6 days after her commissioning, after enough fighting for 10 ships, USS Hornet slips to the bottom of the Santa Cruz Islands under 3 miles of water. Her Avenger, will not be long in coming.
October 26, 1942, the USS Hornet CV-8 was sunk at the Battle of Santa Cruz. Following the sinking of that ship, the U.S. Navy and President Roosevelt wanted to get another USS Hornet out. And at that time in Newport News, Virginia, another ship, a keel was laid and was being built. It was going to be called the USS Kearsarge. But they quickly changed the name from that ship to become the USS Hornet CV-12.
While Hornet CV-8 has been battling and dying, the rapidly expanding Essex class of carriers arrives with a lot of lessons learned. She is built by the Newport News Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company, in the same slipway where Hornet CV-8 was built, less than 2 years before.
That ship was built in 12 months in Newport News. They put 3 crews on that ship, and they used largely welding to put it together, which is quicker, more efficient than all the riveting of the old type construction.
The new Hornet slides down the ways on August 30th, 1943. She is christened by the same woman who had sent her predecessor ship down the ways, the wife of Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox. This Hornet is more potent than the last. She holds double the aircraft carried by many flat tops of other navies, carrying over 100 planes. Hornet boards a 5th Air Group, having learned that another fighter squadron is needed to protect the carrier and its task group. Hornet sails out of Norfolk on February 14, 1943, headed for the Pacific. She is primed and ready for war.
Most of us were, like myself, 20, 21, 22 years old, and didn't really have much of any obligation back home. So it takes young pilots, young people to do this.
After strikes on the Palaus and New Guinea, Hornet joins Task Group 58's huge attack against Truk, the supposedly impregnable forward base of the Imperial fleet. At Truk, Hornet's pilots join in a massacre of Japanese planes and ships so complete that the attacked fortress is left with no significant aircraft or warships to threaten Allied lifelines. The island is bypassed with its 50,000 marooned defenders. On June 6, 1944, the same day as the D-Day landings in Normandy, Hornet is sailing in the Pacific at the heart of another massive tide-turning invasion. Hornet moves with Task Force 58 that has built its power to 7 large and 8 smaller carriers. The massively rebuilt U.S. Navy carries a total of 934 warplanes and an enormous invasion fleet bound for the heavily defended Japanese stronghold of the Mariana Islands.
When you're on the carrier and you're flying combat missions, you always kind of take a last look around, and you wonder if I'll ever see it again. The battle really started when the Japanese launched their planes from 600 or 700 miles from Guam. When the Japanese finally got there, they were able to do very little damage to our fleet because they were practically out of fuel. And so they had to land on Guam and try to refuel.
This desperate act by the Japanese created a virtual shooting gallery for the Americans, which became known as the Marianas Turkey Shoot. Of 327 enemy planes destroyed that day, the Hornet's pilots account for 52 all by themselves.
Our scouting planes finally discovered the Jap fleet, their location. But by the time this happened, It was already late in the afternoon. But Admiral Michener decided that we would take a chance and launch the planes. So they launched the planes a little before sunset, knowing that they would have great difficulty in getting back.
Hornet's dive bombers hit and severely damaged the carrier Zuikaku, the last survivor of the Pearl Harbor strike force. Overall, an enemy light carrier is sunk and 3 other carriers hit. But now, the fuel-starved planes must find a blacked-out Hornet, a dot in the vast, dark Pacific. Admiral Michener takes a calculated gamble in submarine-infested waters.
Admiral Michener decided to turn all the lights on in the carriers so that the guys struggling to get back before they ran out of fuel would be able to see where the carriers in the fleet were.
More than half of her 56 launched planes have not returned. By dawn, 21 planes were still missing. But almost all the pilots had been accounted for on other carriers. Incredibly, Hornet has lost just 2 aviators. There is little time to mourn losses. During attacks on Iwo Jima and the Bonin Islands, her pilots bagged 67 attacking planes on June 24th alone. And she racks up another 35 kills on July 3rd. But Hornet's hard war is about to get harder. From September 1944 through the next 5 exhausting months, Hornet racks up kills that will add to her total of over 70 ships and 1,400 planes destroyed. Off Iwo and the Philippines, Formosa and the Bonin Islands, the gray ghost that the Japanese thought they had finished in the Solomons returns to haunt her enemies, all the while fighting for her own preservation. By the time Hornet arrives off Okinawa to support the American invasion scheduled for April 7th, the Japanese have brought a new mass attack weapon into devastating use.
We heard that planes were beginning to crash dive on ships, and I don't recall exactly how I heard the word kamikaze, but it became a very familiar word.
The word kamikaze translates to divine wind, a reference to a legendary typhoon said to have saved Japan from a Mongol invasion fleet in the late 13th century.
They would drink this ceremonial sake wine to celebrate their sacrifice, and away they would go. We were so thankful that we had a combat air patrol. We called it a CAP. They were fighter planes, and they would circle the task force to prevent kamikazes from getting in. Well, each carrier had put up a number of these, so we had a lot of guys up there doing that. But they came out in such numbers that they eventually, a few of them got through. Then you depended on the guys with the 20 millimeters, the 40 millimeters, the 5-inch cannon on each ship, knocking them down. And yet, through that hail of fire, every once in a while, one would still manage to come in and make a dive on your ship.
I looked out to the port side of the ship, and I could see this Japanese plane bearing down on us, which was a torpedo plane that was going to ram us. We had all these planes on the hangar deck loaded with bombs and fuel. Well, if he'd have rammed us right then and there, it'd have blown us out of the water. But I said a quick prayer, and when that happened, a 5-inch gun hit him in the nose, and he exploded. I said a prayer that my mother taught me.
While we were under attack, 59 times, we were never hit by a kamikaze. They came so close that they were hit and on fire and exploding and hitting the water close enough to splash on our ship. It was a time where you would have two emotions. One would be fear and one would be anger, and that one would override the other from time to time.
The thousands of sailors in the United States fleet off Japan were in a battle as great as any fought on land. In 40 days, beginning on March 4th, Hornet's pilots fly over 4,000 combat sorties, and kamikaze pilots attack the ship scores of times. On June 3, 1945, after surviving more months of high-intensity attacks on the enemy and defending herself against the kamikazes, Hornet takes her most damaging blow of the war from nature. A raging typhoon overtakes her.
The waves of the typhoon would actually go above the mast of the ship. They were that high. And when we hit this typhoon, I was standing amidships of the Hornet on the hangar deck, and the Hornet was bending like this, and I thought surely we're going to capsize. This big wave hit the bow, and it buckled the forward part of the bow of the Hornet, so that we were not able to launch our planes.
Of course, we got up on the flight deck and was cheering it, because we said, this is going to make us go home, you know, finally after 17 months.
Hornet, in San Francisco for repairs when the war ends on September 2nd, 1945, has delivered her revenge. In World War II, she has steamed over 150,000 miles, destroyed 668 enemy planes in the air and 742 on the ground. She has sunk an enemy carrier, a cruiser, 10 destroyers, and 42 other ships. She has launched 18,570 combat sorties. Amazingly, she has never been hit by a bomb, torpedo, or kamikaze.
We were the only Essex-class carrier of that size that did not take a hit by the Japanese.
I just thought that the Hornet was one of the luckiest ships out there that we never did get hit with a bomb. We had them thrown at us, but we were fortunate not to get hit. I don't know what you'd call it, but I just call it luck.
To survive all that will threaten her in the next half-century, Hornet will need a lot more than luck. With the end of World War II in 1945, Hornet's true glory days are ended. Over the next half of the 20th century, she slides in and out of the mothball fleet, along the way receiving extensive modernization, including an angled flight deck. But the rapid advent of bigger, faster, heavier jet aircraft quickly take her off the cutting edge of sea weapons. In 1967, she served in the Vietnam War, launching helicopters instead of planes, supporting Navy and Marine aircraft in round-the-clock search and rescue missions. Post-Vietnam, she is a key part of the sea recovery of astronauts in the early space program in 1969, plucking Neil Armstrong, Michael Collins, and Edwin Aldrin from the sea at the end of the Apollo 11 lunar landing mission. But in a modernized Navy, her time is running out. The USS Hornet is decommissioned on June 30th, 1970. Stripped of non-essential parts, she makes a final voyage under her own power to Puget Sound Naval Shipyard to be prepared for storage. Towed from there to Bremerton, Washington, Hornet sits mothballed and slowly forgotten for 24 years. In 1987, an inspection shows that time and the march of technology have passed the old ship hopelessly by. All funding for preservation is suspended, and she is recommended for disposal. Outraged, Hornet veterans form an organization calling itself the USS Hornet Historical Museum Association. They will try to acquire her out of the Navy's ship donation program.
The Navy said that we had to have $3.5 million and a business plan, approved business plan to get it. We couldn't meet the $3.5 million by their deadline. The ship was then sold for $167,000 to a scrap dealer in the San Francisco Bay Area.
An unwitting ally in the fight to save Hornet will be the Environmental Protection Agency, which has found scrapped hulls to be virtual toxic waste dumps, loaded with lead, asbestos, waste oil, and PCBs. The agency rules that someone has to pay for the removal of over 1,300 items containing PCBs before the ship can be moved to be cut up. The environmental costs and delays stretch out into years. She is towed down to Long Beach in 1994, and then to Hunters Point in San Francisco, where Astoria Metals has finally gained EPA permission to scrap her. But now the scrappers, contending with California's even stricter environmental laws, face costly new delays. Fate comes aboard. Like Hornet, the old Alameda Naval Air Station across the bay from San Francisco at Oakland has outlived her time and been designated for elimination. Captain Jim Dodge, the Alameda Naval Air Station's last commander, has decided the base should go out in style, culminating 5 months of festivities with an open house during Fleet Week 1995.
He said he looked out of his office, and coming across the bay undertow was an Essex-class carrier. He had not seen one of these in years. So he inquired, found out it was the Hornet. It was to be taken across the bay and to be destroyed for scrap.
Dodge decides to make the rusting hulk of Hornet a curiosity and focal point of his celebration. He asks if he can borrow the ship for Alameda for 5 months, after which Astoria could tow the ship back to begin the scrapping process.
We give him all type of credit for being able to, if you will, push the right buttons and pull the right levers to get the ship moved from Hunters Point over to Alameda Naval Air Station at that time for the Fleet Week of 1995. One of our members, John Hawkins, who did an awful lot of research on the Hornet, found out that the USS Hornet was a National Historic Landmark. So the Navy had to hustle up and go back to the scrap dealer and buy the ship back at a substantial amount of money more than what they sold it to the scrap dealer. So then it was put back in the ship donation program.
Hornet proves the hit of Alameda's closing party, and she becomes the center of a full-fledged campaign to give her a permanent and spectacular home. Hardly more than 5 years later, the recommissioned Hornet floats as a museum ship at the same pier where her predecessor took aboard the Doolittle heroes for the first strike at Tokyo. Americans born 50 years too late to have known her during the ship's fighting decades can stand at the edge of a flight deck at the spot that launched 19,000 combat sorties against enemies in a desperate time.
The ship represents everything that American stands for. She is sitting there at peace, just as graceful as the day she was commissioned.